They laughed when Claire Bennett inherited a greenhouse that wasn't even worth the broken glass still hanging from its rusted frame. 6 days later, nobody was laughing. Blue and red emergency lights flashed across the overgrown property as sheriff's deputies pushed reporters behind yellow barricades. A black luxury SUV came to a violent stop beside the iron gate. Miles Crawford, the city's most powerful property developer, jumped out before the vehicle had fully stopped. "Move!" He shoved past 2 deputies and sprinted toward the shattered greenhouse. "You don't understand!" he shouted. "She can't open it!" Nobody listened. 38 feet beneath the cracked stone floor, hidden below roots that hadn't seen daylight in nearly 70 years, Claire Bennett stood alone with an antique brass key in one hand and a faded leather journal in the other. Miles had already borrowed $23,400,000 against this land. His lenders expected ownership by Friday. If Claire unlocked the chamber before he reached her, his company would collapse. His investors would discover the fraud, and every lie he'd spent 15 years burying would finally surface. He rushed into the tunnel. Claire didn't run. She quietly pulled an old cast-iron lever mounted beside the entrance. A deafening rumble rolled through the underground passage. Massive stone doors began sliding shut. For the first time since she'd met him, Miles Crawford looked terrified. 6 days earlier, Claire Bennett's entire life fit inside 18 cardboard boxes. At 32 years old, she worked double shifts at Millie's Diner on the edge of Ashcombe, balancing heavy breakfast plates from 5 every morning until nearly 3 in the afternoon. The regular customers knew her by name. They also knew she smiled even on days when she clearly hadn't slept. Nobody knew she had been living on instant noodles for almost 2 weeks. Her checking account held exactly $12.17. The envelope inside her purse contained $83.40 in tips from that morning. Rent was already 21 days overdue. The eviction notice taped to her apartment door gave her 48 hours to leave. Claire folded the notice carefully instead of tearing it down. She didn't know why. Maybe because once she pulled it off the door, the words would become real. Final notice: vacate property. No further extensions. She slipped it into her purse beside the tips. Her phone buzzed. Unknown caller. "Miss Bennett?" an older man's voice asked after she answered. "Yes. This is Harold Simmons from Harrison Cole Probate Services. We're calling regarding the estate of Eleanor Whitmore." Claire frowned. "I think you've got the wrong person." "No, ma'am." A pause. "You've been named in her last will and testament." Claire closed her eyes for a second. She hadn't spoken to Eleanor in nearly 8 months, not because they'd argued, because work kept getting in the way, then bills, then overtime. She kept telling herself she'd visit next weekend. There wasn't a next weekend. Eleanor Whitmore had died quietly in her sleep 3 days earlier at the age of 81. The funeral was scheduled for Thursday morning. The will reading would follow that afternoon. "I don't think she had much," Claire said softly. Mr. Simmons replied with professional calm. "That may be true. Even so, your attendance has been specifically requested." The line disconnected. Thursday arrived under cold rain. The funeral lasted 31 minutes. Only 14 people attended. Most spent more time checking their watches than listening to the pastor. Claire remained after everyone else walked away. She placed a single white carnation beside Eleanor's grave. "I'm sorry I was late." The flower bent slightly in the wind. Nothing else moved. An hour later, 14 folding chairs filled the conference room at Harrison Cole. Relatives filled 13 of them. Claire quietly took the last seat. She noticed Miles Crawford standing near the windows. He wasn't family. Yet somehow he looked more confident than anyone in the room. Attorney Harold Simmons unfolded the final version of Eleanor Whitmore's will. Jewelry, investment accounts, savings, antique furniture. Each item disappeared into someone else's hands. Then Harold adjusted his glasses. And finally, every face turned toward Claire. To Miss Claire Bennett. She straightened in her chair. I leave the sum of exactly $9. Laughter broke out before he finished reading. And full ownership of my Victorian greenhouse located at 114 Ashcombe Road. The room erupted. One cousin actually slapped the table. Another leaned back, laughing so hard tears formed in his eyes. Miles Crawford smiled. Not politely, cruelly. He looked directly at Claire and said loud enough for everyone to hear, $9 and a pile of weeds. That's probably the most valuable thing you'll ever own. The laughter doubled. Harold slid a small weathered envelope across the polished table. Inside rested a faded $10 bill with $1 missing. Alongside it was a folded, handwritten note. Claire unfolded it ruefully. Only 7 words appeared. Keep the change. Trust the bricks before the glass. Her fingers stopped moving before she could ask what it meant. Miles Crawford reached into his leather briefcase and placed a contract on the table. I'll save you the trouble, he said. My company will pay you $42,300 for the greenhouse the moment the 1-year restriction expires. The room fell silent. 30 seconds earlier, everyone had laughed because the property was worthless. Now the richest developer in Ashcombe wanted it before Claire had even seen it. She slowly looked up. Miles wasn't smiling anymore. Claire didn't touch the contract. She let it sit between them while the room watched in complete silence. $42,300. It was more money than she'd earned during the last 16 months serving coffee, carrying heavy breakfast platters, and pretending she wasn't exhausted. Enough to erase every unpaid bill sitting on her kitchen counter, enough to keep a roof over her head. Still, one question refused to leave her mind. Why would a man worth hundreds of millions pay that much for a greenhouse everyone had mocked less than a minute earlier? Harold Simmons cleared his throat. I'm afraid there's one additional condition Mrs. Whitmore insisted be read aloud. He unfolded another page. The greenhouse, its land, and everything attached to it may not be demolished, excavated, altered structurally, or sold for 365 days following my death. Any violation immediately transfers ownership to the Ashcombe Historical Trust. Miles Crawford's jaw tightened, only for an instant. Then his polished smile returned. A strange old woman, he said with a quiet chuckle. She was always sentimental. Nobody laughed this time. Claire noticed it. His fingers had begun tapping against the edge of the conference table, fast, impatient. Harold slid another item across to her, an old brass key. It was heavier than she expected, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Hanging from it was a faded leather tag with only one word written in neat blue ink. Greenhouse. Mrs. Whitmore instructed that this key be given only to Miss Bennett. Claire turned it over in her hand. There wasn't anything unusual about it, at least not yet. The meeting ended minutes later. Relatives hurried out discussing jewelry, investment accounts, and lakefront property. Nobody bothered saying goodbye. Outside, rain drummed against the courthouse steps. Claire stood beneath the awning, wondering whether to call her landlord one last time. Before she could unlock her car, a black Mercedes rolled quietly beside the curb. The passenger window lowered. Miles Crawford rested one arm on the door. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Claire didn't answer. I know you're having financial problems. That caught her attention. He smiled politely. A small town, here's things. He reached into his jacket and removed another envelope. This one contains $50,000. He held it between 2 fingers. Cash. Claire stared at it. No inspections, no lawyers, no questions. You simply sign an agreement, promising to sell me the greenhouse the first day you're legally allowed." She glanced at the envelope, then at the brass key still resting in her palm. "You've never even seen the property," Miles continued. "Trust me, it's falling apart." "Then why do you want it?" For the first time since they'd met, he hesitated. Barely a second. "Location," he replied. "Nothing more." The answer sounded practiced, too practiced. Claire slipped the key into her coat pocket. "I'm keeping it." Miles sighed through his nose. "I was hoping you'd say yes." His smile remained. His eyes didn't. The Mercedes pulled away without another word. Claire watched it disappear into the rain until only the taillights remained. Then she unfolded Eleanor's handwritten note again. "Keep the change. Trust the bricks before the glass." She read the sentence 5 times. She had no idea what it meant, but somewhere across town, Miles Crawford had already picked up his phone. "I need demolition estimates," he said quietly, "and move the Friday meeting forward." There was a pause. "No," his voice hardened. "She cannot be allowed to spend a single night inside that greenhouse." Claire drove to the greenhouse the following morning because she had nowhere else to go. Her apartment no longer felt like home. Half her belongings were already packed into cardboard boxes borrowed from the diner. The refrigerator held a carton of milk that expired 4 days earlier and half a loaf of bread. Even the coffee maker had been boxed. The address Eleanor had left was only 23 miles outside Ashcombe. The farther she drove, the narrower the roads became. Telephone poles leaned at odd angles. Old stone fences disappeared beneath climbing ivy. Every few miles she passed abandoned farmhouses whose windows had surrendered to time years ago. The GPS lost signal 2 miles before the destination. She followed a faded wooden sign that simply read, "Whitmore Estate." The last half-mile was nothing but cracked gravel. Branches scraped both sides of her aging Honda. When the trees finally opened, Claire eased onto the brakes. The greenhouse was enormous, far larger than she'd imagined. Its Victorian iron frame still stood proudly despite decades of neglect. Hundreds of cracked glass panels reflected the grey afternoon sky like broken mirrors. Thick vines wrapped around the structure so tightly that parts of the building seemed swallowed by the forest itself. Nature hadn't destroyed it. It had claimed it. Claire stepped out of the car. The air smelled different here. Wet earth, wild rosemary, something sweet she couldn't identify. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then she noticed something strange. The gravel driveway had fresh tire tracks. Not one vehicle, several. Wide construction tires. They hadn't been there long. Rainwater still pooled inside the grooves instead of washing them away. She slowly followed them. The tracks circled the greenhouse once before stopping near the eastern wall. Boot prints covered the mud. Someone had been walking around the property recently. Many people, yet Eleanor had lived alone. Claire looked toward the old house, sitting 50 yards away. Every curtain was closed. The porch swing moved gently, even though the wind had faded. She couldn't explain why, but the place didn't feel abandoned. It felt interrupted. She unlocked the greenhouse gate with the brass key. The rusty lock opened immediately, too easily. Inside, sunlight filtered through broken glass and painted uneven shapes across the stone floor. Long wooden planting tables stretched from one end of the building to the other, covered in dusty clay pots, cracked watering cans, and empty seed trays. Most plants had died years ago. A few stubborn roses still bloomed near the center aisle. Claire smiled despite herself. Eleanor would have liked that. As she walked deeper inside, her shoe struck something solid beneath a layer of fallen leaves. Clink. She bent down. Half buried in the dirt was a brand-new orange survey flag. Another stood 12 feet away, then another. Someone had professionally marked sections of the greenhouse floor, not randomly in straight lines. Claire slowly stood. Survey flags, fresh tire tracks, construction boots, and a developer willing to pay $50,000 for a collapsing greenhouse. None of it fit together. A sudden engine growled somewhere beyond the trees. Claire hurried toward the entrance. By the time she reached the gate, a black pickup truck was already turning into the driveway. The pickup stopped so suddenly that loose gravel rattled against Claire's shoes. She instinctively tightened her grip around the brass key inside her coat pocket. The driver's door creaked open. An elderly man climbed out slowly, one boot finding the ground before the other. He looked well into his 70s, broad-shouldered despite his age, wearing faded denim overalls beneath a weathered brown jacket. His grey beard had escaped any attempt at order months ago. Instead of walking toward Claire immediately, he removed his cap. "Well," his voice carried the slow drawl of someone who had spent an entire lifetime in the countryside. "I'll be." Claire waited. The old man looked past her toward the greenhouse before smiling faintly. "Thought I'd never see that gate unlocked again." "You knew Eleanor?" "Knew her?" He chuckled softly. "Miss Eleanor used to chase me out of this greenhouse with a broom when I was 12, claimed I picked tomatoes before they were ready." He extended a rough, calloused hand. "Name's Walter Briggs." Claire shook it. "I'm Claire. I know exactly who you are." That caught her off guard. Walter noticed the surprise on her face. "Word travels faster than pickup trucks around here." He glanced toward the fresh survey flags scattered across the property. "So..." He finally made his move. "He?" "Miles Crawford." Claire said nothing. Walter sighed. "I figured." He reached into the bed of his pickup and pulled out a worn metal toolbox. "I've been fixing fences around these parts for 40 years. Last Tuesday, I saw men in expensive boots walking this property with survey equipment. They were here before Eleanor died." Walter nodded once. 3 days before. Claire looked back at the greenhouse. Did Eleanor know? Oh, she knew. He smiled in a way that suggested there was more to the story. She chased him clean and off the property. Claire couldn't help smiling. "I wish I'd seen that." "Oh, it was worth watching." Walter laughed quietly. "That little lady stood right over there with a shovel in one hand and told Mr. Crawford if he stepped through her gate again, she'd plant him beside the roses." The smile disappeared from Claire's face as quickly as it had arrived. If she hated him that much, why didn't she sell? Walter became unusually quiet. He scratched his beard, then looked toward the greenhouse instead of Claire. Because she wasn't protecting the building. What was she protecting? The old man hesitated, long enough for Claire to notice. Finally, he shook his head. "No." "What do you mean, no?" "If Miss Eleanor wanted you to know, she'll tell you herself." Claire frowned. "She's gone." Walter tipped his cap toward the greenhouse. "Maybe." He picked up the toolbox again. "Or maybe she already left the answers exactly where you'd never think to look." Before Claire could ask another question, a deep mechanical growl echoed across the valley. Both of them turned. A yellow bulldozer was crawling along the dirt road nearly half a mile away. Behind it came 2 white construction trucks. Walter's expression hardened. "They're early." Claire looked at him. "Early for what?" Walter didn't answer. He was already reaching for the shotgun mounted inside the cab of his pickup. Walter rested one hand on the shotgun, but never pulled it free. "Easy," he muttered. "No sense making today uglier than it needs to be." The convoy stopped outside the iron entrance. The bulldozer idled. 2 white utility trucks parked behind it. A man wearing a fluorescent safety vest stepped out carrying a clipboard. Behind him came 3 workers in hard hats, none of whom looked interested in the greenhouse. They kept glancing toward the ground instead. Claire walked toward the gate before Walter could stop her. "Can I help you?" The foreman smiled, the kind of smile that disappeared the moment business became inconvenient. "Routine inspection. This is private property." He checked his clipboard. "We received authorization to evaluate unsafe structures." "From who?" "The county." Walter let out a dry laugh. "The county usually sends one inspector." He pointed toward the bulldozer. "Not enough condemned tomato plants to justify bringing one of those." The foreman's smile faded. "Our equipment is standard procedure." "No," Walter replied. "Standard procedure is knocking first." The workers exchanged uneasy looks. Claire noticed something else. One man carried rolled survey maps instead of inspection forms. Another wore polished dress shoes beneath his construction pants. They weren't here to inspect anything. They were searching. The foreman stepped closer. "Miss Bennett, these buildings are dangerous. We'd strongly recommend you stay away until our report is complete." "I'll take my chances." He lowered his voice. "You've spoken with Mr. Crawford." It wasn't a question. "He made a generous offer." I said no. "You should reconsider." Claire folded her arms. "Why?" The foreman looked toward the greenhouse before answering. "Old buildings become expensive," Walter snorted. "So do lawsuits." Silence settled between them. Breeze carried the scent of damp ivy across the yard. Then something unexpected happened. One of the younger workers accidentally dropped a folded blueprint. It unfolded across the gravel. Claire only saw it for 2 seconds before he snatched it back. 2 thick red circles had been drawn beneath the greenhouse floor. Not inside the walls. Beneath them. The worker's face drained of color. The foreman shot him a furious look. "Back in the truck." Nobody argued. Within seconds, every map disappeared. Every clipboard closed. The foreman climbed into his pickup, but left the window lowered. "You've inherited more trouble than you realize, Miss Bennett," Walter answered before Claire could. "Funny." "What?" "You sound scared." The convoy pulled away without another word. The rumble of heavy engines faded into the surrounding hills. Claire turned toward Walter. "You saw the map." "I surely did." "There were circles under the greenhouse." Walter nodded. "I wasn't hoping you'd notice that today." "You knew?" "I suspected." He stared quietly at the old building for several moments. "When I was a boy, Miss Eleanor used to tell me something every spring before planting season." He smiled at the memory. "I figured it was just one of her odd little sayings." "What did she say?" Walter looked directly at Claire. "The truth never grows beneath the glass." He paused. "It waits where the bricks remember." Claire felt the folded note inside her pocket. Trust the bricks before the glass. She slowly looked down at the greenhouse floor. For the first time, the bricks seemed to matter far more than the shattered roof above them. Walter never took the shotgun from the rack. He simply left his weathered hand resting against the wooden stock while the construction vehicles disappeared beyond the bend in the road. "They ain't done," he muttered. Claire looked toward him. "You knew they'd come." Walter nodded slowly. "Been expecting it since Eleanor passed." He walked toward the greenhouse without another word, stopping beside one of the old brick planting beds. Kneeling with a soft groan, he brushed away a layer of damp moss using the sleeve of his jacket. "Come here." Claire crouched beside him. At first she saw nothing unusual, just old red bricks, some cracked, some uneven. Then Walter pointed with one crooked finger. "Notice anything?" Claire leaned closer. Every brick had been laid in the same direction, except one. Near the corner, a single brick had been turned 90 degrees. She frowned. "That can't be an accident." Walter smiled. Miss Eleanor hated accidents. Claire touched the strange brick. Unlike the others, it wasn't cemented into place. It shifted ever so slightly beneath her fingertips. She looked at Walter. "You've known about this?" "I've known it was different." "You never checked?" Walter chuckled. "Oh, I surely tried." His eyes drifted toward the greenhouse roof. "Eleanor caught me before I got very far." "What did she say?" Walter laughed under his breath. "Walter Briggs, if curiosity paid taxes, you'd own this county." Claire couldn't help smiling. Then Walter's expression settled again. "A week before she died, she asked me something." "What?" "If a young woman ever came looking for answers." He looked directly at Claire. "I was to tell her only one thing." Claire waited. Walter spoke quietly. "Trust the bricks before the glass." Claire reached into her pocket and unfolded Eleanor's note. The exact same sentence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rainwater dripped steadily through a crack in the roof. Somewhere outside, a crow landed on the rusted iron fence. Walter slowly stood. "I reckon that's all the permission I'm supposed to give." Claire looked back at the odd brick. Her fingers slipped underneath its edge. It lifted. Only an inch. Then stopped. Something beneath it blocked the movement. Not dirt. Metal. Her pulse quickened. She brushed away years of packed soil until a narrow strip of black iron became visible. It wasn't a pipe. It was a handle. Old. Hand-forged. Hidden perfectly beneath the loose brick. Claire wrapped both hands around it and pulled. Nothing. She pulled harder. Still nothing. "It's locked," she whispered. Walter knelt again. "No." He ran his rough fingers along the iron before shaking his head. "It ain't locked." "What is it then?" "It's waiting." Claire looked at him in confusion. Walter pointed toward the greenhouse entrance. "Miss Eleanor believed every lock had two parts. The key and the reason." Claire instinctively reached into her coat pocket, the heavy brass key. Until now, she'd assumed it belonged to the front gate, but the gate had opened far too easily, almost as if that had never been its real purpose. At that exact moment, a faint metallic click echoed somewhere beneath the greenhouse floor. Neither of them had touched the handle. Neither of them had moved. Walter's face lost every trace of color. He whispered only 4 words. "Someone else is below." Claire froze. The sound hadn't been loud, just one sharp metallic click, the kind an old latch makes after sitting untouched for decades. Except nothing down there should have been moving. Walter slowly raised one finger to his lips. "Listen." The greenhouse fell silent again. Rain tapped against broken panes overhead. Somewhere in the trees, a woodpecker hammered at dead bark. Then, scrape. It came from beneath their feet, not directly below. Off to the eastern side of the greenhouse, Claire felt the vibration through the soles of her boots. Someone was dragging something heavy across stone. Walter leaned close enough that only she could hear him. "Don't say another word." He quietly removed the shotgun from the truck for the first time. Claire swallowed. "You really think—" "I think folks who spend $50,000 on a pile of weeds don't quit after hearing no." The scraping stopped. A full minute passed. Neither of them breathed very loudly. Then a faint beam of light appeared. Not inside the greenhouse. Outside. A thin line escaped from between 2 old foundation stones near the eastern planting beds before disappearing again. Claire stared. There. Walter had already seen it. Without speaking, they crossed the greenhouse one careful step at a time. The old bricks creaked beneath their weight. Claire knelt beside the foundation wall. At first, it looked ordinary. Then she noticed fresh dirt packed between the stones. Someone had disturbed it recently. Very recently. Walter crouched beside her and brushed away loose soil with his pocket knife. The blade struck metal. Not iron, steel, modern steel. He uncovered the edge of a narrow access hatch no larger than a suitcase. Brand new hinges, fresh welds. Someone had installed it within the last few months. This wasn't Eleanor, Walter whispered. No. Claire. He ran her fingers across the cold steel. The rust hasn't even started. Walter studied the hinges. They didn't find the old way in. What do you mean? They made themselves one. Before Claire could respond, a truck door slammed outside. Voices, more than one. Walter quietly lowered the shotgun. Back. They slipped behind a row of overgrown citrus trees just as 3 men entered the greenhouse through the front gate. None wore construction uniforms today. Dark jackets. Work boots. One carried a handheld scanner that emitted a slow electronic pulse every few seconds. Beep. 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 The tallest man stopped almost exactly where Claire had found the loose brick. He checked the scanner. Its screen flashed bright green. There, he muttered. I told Crawford this was the spot. Another man shook his head. No. The old woman changed something before she died. We're running out of time. The first man looked toward the greenhouse entrance. Friday. After Friday, the bank owns Crawford's company. Silence settled between them. Then the tallest man kicked the loose brick hard enough to send it tumbling across the floor. Nothing happened. He cursed under his breath. She hid it better than we thought. Claire felt Walter lightly squeeze her arm. He wasn't looking at the men. He was staring at the brass key still clutched tightly in her hand. For the first time, he smiled. I reckon, he whispered. They're searching for the very thing you've been carrying since yesterday. The 3 men remained inside the greenhouse for less than 10 minutes. To Claire, it felt like an hour. She watched from behind the tangled citrus trees as the handheld scanner swept slowly across the old brick floor. Beep. Silence. Another step. Beep. The tallest man stopped beside the eastern planting bed and frowned. It should be here. His partner wiped rainwater from his forehead. We've searched this place 4 times. Then search it a 5th. What if the old woman moved it? The first man looked toward the broken roof. She was 81. People don't haul stone around at 81. Walter leaned close to Claire's ear. They're making one mistake. What? They're searching where they think treasure is. Claire looked at him. And? Eleanor never hid important things where greedy people would look first. A phone vibrated inside the tallest man's pocket. He answered immediately. Yes, Mr. Crawford. Claire couldn't hear the reply, only the man's expression. It changed. Fast. No, she hasn't found anything. Another pause. We'll keep looking. His shoulders stiffened. I understand. The call ended. He slipped the phone away. Crawford says the bank moved the deadline. The younger worker looked confused. I thought Friday was the deadline. It was. Now it's tomorrow. Nobody spoke. Finally, the tallest man exhaled sharply. If we don't find it before tomorrow afternoon. He never finished the sentence. He didn't have to. Every man there suddenly worked twice as fast. Walter quietly smiled. Desperate people make mistakes. 20 minutes later, the vehicles disappeared down the gravel road. Claire waited another full 5 minutes before stepping from her hiding place. The greenhouse felt different now, not abandoned, occupied. Like every shadow had witnessed the conversation, Walter walked straight toward the loose brick. Give me the key. Claire handed him the heavy brass key. He turned it over several times beneath the grey afternoon light. What? This isn't a greenhouse key. I figured that much. He pointed toward the bow. the round handle at the top. Tiny scratches covered the brass, not random scratches. Letters, almost invisible beneath years of tarnish. Walter rubbed the surface with the corner of his handkerchief. Slowly, 4 engraved words appeared. East bed, row 7. Claire stared. That's not a manufacturer's mark. No. Walter looked toward the planting beds. That's directions. They counted carefully. 1, 2, 3, 7 rows. The 7th bed looked no different from the others except for a single stone watering basin resting at its end. Claire stepped beside it. The basin was dry, covered with leaves. As she brushed them away, something caught her eye, carved into the center of the stone. A tiny brass keyhole, no larger than a coin. Walter slowly smiled. I've lived beside this property for 52 years. I never once noticed that. Claire looked down at the key in her hand, then at the ancient keyhole. The brass matched perfectly. She slid the key inside. It fit. Not loosely, not tightly, exactly as though it had been waiting there for decades. Claire wrapped her fingers around the key. Walter took one careful step backward. Go on. She turned it. The mechanism clicked once. Nothing happened. Then, deep beneath the greenhouse, something enormous awakened. The vibration lasted barely 3 seconds, then everything became still again. Claire kept her hand on the brass key, waiting. Nothing. She looked at Walter. That's it. Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched beside the stone basin and rested his palm against its weathered rim. You feel that? Claire copied him, a faint warmth. Not heat, more like stone that had been asleep for decades and had only just remembered the sun. Then came another sound. Click. Not beneath them this time. Behind them. Both turned at once. Near the northern wall of the greenhouse stood an enormous brick planter nearly 8 feet long. It had always looked permanent, packed with dead vines and decades of compacted soil. Now, it had shifted, only an inch. But an inch was enough. Walter slowly stood. I've walked past that planter thousands of times. Claire hurried over. The gap beneath it hadn't existed earlier. Fresh darkness stared back at them. Walter slipped a flashlight from his toolbox and aimed it into the opening. Stone steps. Narrow. Worn smooth with age, leading underground. Neither of them spoke. Claire noticed something lying on the top step. A small clay flower pot, perfectly clean despite everything around it. Inside rested a folded piece of paper wrapped in oilcloth. She carefully picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable. Eleanor's. Only one sentence appeared. If you've reached the stairs, someone else is already too close. Walter quietly exhaled. She knew. Knew what? That somebody would come looking after she was gone. Claire folded the note into her pocket. The flashlight beam drifted farther down the staircase. About 15 steps below, the passage turned sharply left. The rest disappeared into darkness. Walter reached for the first step, then stopped. What? He pointed downward. The door, used to Claire, hadn't noticed at first. The stone steps should have been covered in decades of undisturbed dirt. Instead, someone had walked there recently. Fresh boot prints, large, deep. Heading down, only one set. She counted them instinctively. Size 11, heavy work boots. The return prints were missing. Walter's jaw tightened. Whoever went down never came back up. Claire finished. Neither of them moved. The silence inside the tunnel felt unnaturally thick. Then, somewhere far below, a single metallic clang echoed upward. Not loud, just enough to prove one thing. The tunnel wasn't empty. Walter looked toward Claire. "We leave." "What?" "We come back tomorrow with more people." Claire shook her head. "If Crawford's deadline is tomorrow." She glanced toward the staircase. "We don't have tomorrow." Walter hated that she was right. He checked the shotgun. 2 shells. He loaded both. Claire switched on the flashlight from her phone. The weak white beam stretched only a few yards before the darkness swallowed it. Walter stepped onto the first stone stair. It groaned beneath his weight. Claire followed. Behind them, the ancient planter slowly rolled back into its original position. Neither of them noticed. The entrance disappeared, and with it, the only easy way back to the surface. The air changed after the first dozen steps. It grew cooler, damp enough that every breath carried the smell of old limestone and wet earth instead of flowers and rain. Walter swept the flashlight across the narrow passage. The walls had been carved by hand. Not recently. Whoever built this tunnel had done it generations earlier, shaping each block with careful precision. The ceiling arched just high enough for Walter to stand upright, while Claire found herself brushing strands of spiderweb from her face every few feet. They descended another 20 yards before the staircase leveled into a corridor. Claire's phone had almost no signal. No surprise there. What surprised her was something else. Electrical conduit. Old steel conduit. Running neatly along one wall. This place had power. Walter nodded slowly. "Looks like it. But why? I don't reckon folks install electricity under a greenhouse unless they planned on using it." The corridor ended at a thick oak door reinforced with black iron straps. Unlike everything else, this door had been maintained. The hinges showed almost no rust. Claire reached toward the handle. Walter stopped her. "Listen first." Both stood motionless. Nothing. No voices, no footsteps, only water dripping somewhere deeper inside. Claire wrapped her fingers around the iron handle and pushed. The door opened with surprising ease. A circular stone chamber stretched before them. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, not filled with gold, not jewels. Clay pots. Hundreds of them, each carefully labeled in faded handwriting. For 1891, 1903, 1917. Walter picked one up carefully. He read the label aloud. Scarlet Emperor Bean. Claire opened another. Inside rested dozens of tiny seeds wrapped in wax paper. "They're seeds?" Walter looked around the room. "No." His voice had changed. "Their history." Claire turned slowly in place. Every shelf held different varieties. Vegetables, flowers, herbs, fruit trees, thousands of carefully preserved seed packets. Many carried names she'd never heard before. Then she noticed a framed certificate hanging alone on the far wall. The paper had yellowed with age. Still, the seal remained clear. United States Department of Agriculture. Official Heritage Preservation Registry. Below it, one handwritten sentence had been added decades earlier. "The Whitmore collection shall never be divided." Claire frowned. "This isn't a treasure." Walter looked at her. "It depends who's buying." Before either of them could say another word, Claire's phone vibrated. One bar of signal, an incoming call. Miles Crawford. She stared at the screen. Walter nodded once. "Answer it." Claire pressed accept. Miles didn't waste time. "I'll offer you $300,000. Claire said nothing. "You've found something." Still silence. I don't know what it is, Miles admitted. But I know Eleanor never fought this hard over weeds. Claire looked around the chamber, rows upon rows of priceless heirloom seeds. She suddenly understood. He didn't know. Not yet. What if I say no? Miles's voice lost every trace of warmth. Then, tomorrow, he paused, none of what's standing on that property will still be standing. The line went dead. Walter slowly lowered the phone from Claire's hand. He just told us exactly when he's coming. Claire slipped the phone into her pocket. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The underground chamber suddenly felt much smaller. $300,000. Miles Crawford had raised his offer sevenfold without asking a single question. That alone told Claire everything she needed to know. He wasn't buying a greenhouse. He was buying silence. Walter carefully returned the clay jar to its shelf. You know what these are? Claire shook her head. They're heirloom seeds. I figured that much. No. Walter smiled faintly. These aren't the kind you buy at a garden center. He picked up another jar marked simply, Whitmore Crimson Tomato, 1897. My grandfather used to talk about these. Claire looked at the tiny paper packet inside. They're over 100 years old. Some are closer to 150. They still grow? Walter nodded. If they've been stored properly, he looked around the chamber. And, judging by this place, Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing. Claire's eyes wandered across the endless shelves. Every jar had been catalogued, numbered, dated. Someone had spent decades protecting this collection. Then she noticed something odd. One shelf stood completely empty. Dust covered every board in the room, except there. The wood looked clean, recently disturbed. Walter. He followed her gaze. Something's missing. 8 spaces, exactly 8 clay jars, small brass labels remained beneath each empty position. Collection A, Collection B, Collection C. The lettering continued until Collection H, nothing else. Walter rubbed his beard. Eleanor didn't leave empty shelves. Claire stepped closer. A faint rectangle in the dust suggested something larger had rested behind the missing jars. She carefully brushed away loose dirt with her sleeve. A narrow brass plaque slowly appeared. It wasn't attached to the shelf. It had been hidden behind the jars. Engraved across the metal were 12 words. The collection is only the door. The inheritance waits beneath the roots. Claire read the sentence twice. Walter let out a low whistle. So this room isn't the destination, Claire finished. It's only the first stop. Walter's flashlight drifted toward the stone floor. One flagstone looked slightly darker than the others. Not because of age, because someone had cleaned it recently. Claire knelt. The stone carried faint scrape marks around its edges. She slid her fingers along the narrow gap. Cold air drifted upward. There was another space below. Before she could investigate further, a distant thud echoed through the tunnel. Both froze. Another thud. Closer. Walter extinguished the flashlight instantly. Darkness swallowed the chamber. The only light came from Claire's phone screen. Then, voices. Muffled, but unmistakable. They came back, Walter whispered. Claire held her breath. Heavy boots struck the stone staircase somewhere beyond the oak door. One, then another. The visitors weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Whoever was entering the tunnel believed it already belonged to them. Walter slowly opened the shotgun. He stared inside. 2 shells. Exactly 2. He clicked it shut. Claire. She looked at him. No matter what happens. His voice barely carried through the darkness. Don't let them find that brass key. The footsteps stopped outside the oak door. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. The sort that made every small sound seem louder than it really was. Claire could hear water dripping somewhere behind the shelves. Walter's breathing had become slow and deliberate. He positioned himself beside the doorway where the darkness swallowed him almost completely. The shotgun remained pointed toward the floor, not out of mercy, because there were only 2 shells left. A flashlight beam slipped beneath the narrow gap under the door. Someone tested the handle. It didn't move. A muffled voice broke the silence. I know somebody's in there. Another voice answered. Break it. The first impact shook dust from the ceiling. Boom. The old oak door held. A second strike followed. Harder. The iron hinges groaned but refused to surrender. Walter leaned close to Claire. Take the key. She already had. No, he frowned. If they get through, I'm not leaving you. His weathered face softened for only a moment. You remind me of Eleanor. The third blow landed. A crack spread through one corner of the ancient door. Claire looked around the chamber. There had to be another way out. The shelves, the floor, the ceiling. Nothing. Then her flashlight caught something hidden behind the lowest row of seed jars. A narrow iron ring, almost invisible against the stone wall. She crouched beside it. What did you find? I don't know yet. Claire pulled gently. The ring refused to move. She wiped away years of dust. A tiny engraving appeared around its base. Trust the bricks before the glass. The sentence again. She looked down. Unlike the rest of the chamber, this section of wall had been built with old handmade bricks instead of carved stone. Walter suddenly understood. The bricks. Claire pressed against one. Nothing. She tried another. Still nothing. Behind them, crash. The oak door split open another few inches. Light flooded through the widening crack. We're almost in, someone shouted. Walter raised the shotgun. His finger settled against the trigger. Claire forced herself to ignore the panic. Bricks. Eleanor had repeated the same message 3 different times. Notes. The greenhouse. Now, here. It wasn't a clue. It was an instruction. She examined the wall more carefully. Every brick had the same rough surface, except one. Its face carried a tiny pressed image of a rose, no larger than a thumbnail. Claire pushed it. A dull click echoed somewhere inside the wall. Nothing happened. She pushed harder. The entire brick slid inward 1/2 inch. Immediately. The iron ring loosened. Claire grabbed it with both hands and pulled. This time it moved. A section of the brick wall silently swung inward, revealing a narrow passage barely wide enough for one person. Cold air rushed from the darkness beyond. Walter smiled. I knew she built another way. You first, Claire whispered. Walter shook his head. You've got the key. Another violent crash exploded behind them. The oak door burst halfway open. A flashlight beam swept across the chamber. There they are! Walter fired. The blast thundered through the underground room. Wood splintered. One man screamed. The others dropped behind the broken doorway. Without waiting to see what happened, Claire grabbed Walter's arm. Together they disappeared into the hidden passage. As the brick wall slowly swung shut behind them, one of Miles Crawford's men shouted the words that made Claire's blood run cold. Don't let them reach the second vault. The hidden passage closed with barely a whisper. A heartbeat later, another shotgun blast echoed from the chamber they had escaped. Not Walter's. One of Crawford's men had fired blindly through the broken doorway. Stone dust drifted from the ceiling. Claire kept moving. The tunnel narrowed until both of them had to turn sideways to squeeze through certain sections. The brick walls gave way to rough limestone, damp with centuries of underground moisture. Water collected in shallow grooves cut into the floor, flowing gently downhill. Walter stopped long enough to listen. "They're coming." Claire looked behind them. Nothing but darkness. "How can you tell?" "They've got flashlights." Sure enough, a faint ribbon of white light flickered through tiny gaps in the stonework several yards back. They hadn't lost them. They had only slowed them down. The passage curved sharply before opening into another corridor, this one taller and surprisingly clean. Someone had swept this place. Recently, no cobwebs, very little dust. Claire's flashlight settled on the floor. Footprints, not the heavy boot prints they'd seen before. These were smaller, lighter. An older person's walking shoes. The impressions overlapped each other dozens of times. Walter smiled quietly. "Eleanor? She came down here?" "More than once." Claire followed the trail. It ended beside a small wooden table tucked into a shallow alcove carved into the rock. A kerosene lantern rested on one corner. Beside it sat a chipped blue teacup. The tea inside had long since evaporated, leaving only a dark ring around the porcelain. A pair of reading glasses lay folded beside an open notebook. Claire picked it up carefully. The first page carried Eleanor's handwriting. Not a letter. A journal. The final entry was dated only 9 days before her death. Claire read aloud. "If you're reading this, then Miles Crawford finally grew impatient. I suspected he would. Greed rarely learns patience." Walter listened without interrupting. Claire turned the page. "He believes the second vault holds money. His father believed the same thing before him. They have spent 15 years chasing the wrong prize." She looked at Walter. "His father?" Walter's expression changed. "I was wondering when she'd write about that." "You knew his father?" "Knew him too well." Claire continued reading. "Arthur Crawford made me an offer in 1998. His son returned with a larger one in 2011. Neither understood what they were buying. The remaining sentence had been crossed out with thick black ink. Not scribbled, deliberately covered. Claire tilted the page toward the light. She could almost make out the words beneath. Almost. Then something slipped from between the journal pages, a yellowed photograph. It showed Eleanor standing beside a much younger Walter. Between them stood another man, expensively dressed, smiling. Claire turned the picture over. 3 names had been written neatly on the back. Eleanor Whitmore, Walter Briggs, Arthur Crawford. Walter stared at the photograph for several long seconds. Then he whispered something Claire never expected to hear. "I helped Arthur look for the vault." Claire lowered the photograph without taking her eyes off Walter. The silence between them stretched long enough for the lantern on the table to become the loudest thing in the tunnel. "You helped him?" Walter didn't answer right away. He picked up the old teacup from the table, turning it slowly between his hands as though the faded blue porcelain carried memories he wasn't eager to revisit. "I was 36, he said quietly. "My wife had just been diagnosed with kidney failure." Claire remained still. "We didn't have insurance." His voice had lost its usual warmth. "Arthur Crawford came knocking one afternoon, said he'd heard rumors about something hidden beneath the Whitmore property." Walter gave a tired smile. "I thought he was chasing ghost stories." "So you helped him?" "I walked the land with him." Walter nodded once. "For nearly 4 months." He looked toward the stone ceiling. "We dug holes, measured walls, pulled up old foundations, tore apart sheds that had been standing longer than either of us. And Eleanor, she never tried to stop us." Claire frowned. Why? Walter laughed once. A quiet laugh filled with embarrassment. Because she knew we were looking in all the wrong places. He reached into his jacket and unfolded a brittle receipt that had been tucked inside for years. Claire noticed the date, October 18th, 1998. On the back, written in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting, was a single sentence. Some men search with shovels. Wise ones search with questions. I found this in my mailbox the morning after Arthur quit. Walter slipped the receipt back into his pocket. I kept it because I finally understood what she'd been trying to tell me. Claire looked again at Eleanor's journal. The final pages were thicker than the others. As she turned them, something clicked inside the binding. Hidden between two sheets stood another brass object. Not a key, a compass. Unlike any Claire had ever seen. Instead of north, south, east, and west, the face carried 4 engraved words: glass, brick, root, light. The needle spun wildly for several seconds, then settled, not toward north, toward the tunnel ahead. Walter stared. I've never seen that before. Claire picked it up carefully. The needle didn't move. It remained fixed toward the passage, disappearing into darkness. Almost as though it wasn't pointing to a direction. It was pointing to something. They followed it. 30 yards later, the corridor widened into a circular chamber unlike anything they'd seen so far. The room had no shelves, no furniture, only a massive oak door reinforced with black iron. Far larger than the first vault. Centered in the door stood 4 brass keyholes arranged in the shape of a cross. Above them, carved into the wood in elegant script, were the words Eleanor had repeated throughout her life. Trust the bricks before the glass. Claire examined the lock. Her heartbeat slowed, then stopped for a fraction of a second. The brass key she'd carried since the will reading. Fit only 1 of the 4 keyholes. 3 remained empty. Behind them, footsteps echoed through the tunnel again. Closer than before, Claire slipped the brass key into the lower keyhole. It turned smoothly. A heavy click echoed somewhere inside the enormous oak door. Only 1 lock disengaged. 3 remained. She pulled gently on the handle. Nothing. Walter wasn't disappointed. He had expected as much. Eleanor never trusted simple answers. Claire stepped back, studying the door again. 4 keyholes. 4 engraved words on the strange compass. Glass, brick, root, light. The needle still pointed toward the center of the room instead of the door itself. Wait. She lifted the compass. It isn't pointing at the vault. Walter looked down. The needle aimed directly at the stone floor beneath their feet. Claire knelt. Unlike every other chamber, this floor wasn't made from limestone. It was laid with hundreds of perfectly square red bricks. Everyone looked identical, except 1 brick carried the same tiny rose Eleanor had carved beneath the greenhouse. There. Walter dropped beside her. Claire pressed it. Nothing happened. She frowned, then remembered Eleanor's words. Trust the bricks before the glass. Not push. Trust. She slid her fingertips across the surrounding bricks instead. One shifted almost imperceptibly. She lifted it. Beneath the loose brick rested a narrow wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Walter carefully opened it. Inside lay 3 objects: an old iron key, a crystal prism no larger than Claire's thumb, and a polished oak root carved into the shape of a small key. Claire stared. Glass. Walter picked up the prism. Brick. Claire lifted the iron key. Root. Only 1 word remained. Light. Walter slowly turned toward the ceiling. High above, almost hidden by decades of soot, sat a tiny circular opening no wider than a coffee mug. "A skylight," he whispered. "It reaches the greenhouse." Claire looked at her watch. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink. A single shaft of golden light slipped through the narrow opening, striking the crystal prism in Walter's hand. The room changed instantly. Dozens of tiny reflections danced across the walls. One bright beam landed directly on the vault door. Another hidden keyhole appeared, invisible until light touched it. Claire couldn't help smiling. "Eleanor." Walter shook his head in amazement. She thought of everything. Working together, they placed each object where it belonged. The iron key, the wooden root, the brass greenhouse key. Finally, Walter held the crystal prism inside the beam of sunlight. The hidden lock clicked. Deep inside the door, gears that hadn't turned in generations slowly awakened. One after another. 4 distinct metallic clunks rolled through the chamber. The massive oak door trembled. Dust drifted from its hinges. With a slow groan, it opened inward. Claire expected piles of gold, stacks of cash, jewels. Instead, the room beyond looked like a library. Floor-to-ceiling wooden cabinets stretched into the darkness. Hundreds of leather-bound ledgers, thousands of carefully rolled land surveys, metal filing drawers, shelves packed with sealed document tubes. In the center stood a large oak table. Upon it rested a single envelope. Across the front, written in Eleanor Whitmore's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words. For Claire Bennett. Open this before anything else. Claire stood motionless. The envelope rested in the middle of the oak table as though Eleanor herself had placed it there only moments ago. Around them, shelves stretched into the darkness. Leather-bound ledgers, survey maps, property deeds, boxes labeled with years that reached back more than a century. Yet none of it pulled Claire's attention away from the envelope bearing her name. Walter quietly stepped backward. "This part." He removed his cap. "Belongs to you." Claire nodded. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the faded wax seal. Inside rested 6 neatly folded pages. The paper smelled faintly of lavender. She recognized it immediately. Eleanor had always kept lavender sachets inside the drawers of her old writing desk. Claire unfolded the first page. "My dear Claire, if these words have reached your hands, then I was right about 2 things. The first is that I would not live long enough to explain everything myself. The second is that you refused to sell. Thank you. That decision tells me I chose the right person." Claire stopped reading for a moment. Walter quietly looked away, giving her the privacy Eleanor had intended. She continued, "You have probably spent your entire life wondering why I always insisted you visit the greenhouse instead of sitting inside the house, drinking tea with the others. It was because I never cared whether you remembered me. I cared whether you learned to notice what everyone else ignored. You watered dying roses without being asked. You picked broken glass from the paths so birds would not cut their feet. Once, when you were 11, you spent nearly an hour carrying earthworms back into the garden after a heavy rain. You believed no one saw you. I did." Claire smiled through gathering tears. She had forgotten that afternoon, or thought she had. Eleanor remembered every detail. Her letter continued. "My relatives believed inheritance should reward blood. I never agreed. Character grows through choices, not surnames." Claire lowered the pages for a second. The room blurred. She blinked twice before continuing. "What waits inside these cabinets is worth more than money. For 142 years, the Whitmore family quietly collected endangered heirloom seed varieties from farms that no longer exist. Each was documented, protected, shared with researchers whenever crops failed across this country. The collection saved lives during droughts. It fed families who never knew my family's name. That was always enough. Claire looked around the room again. Now the ledgers made sense. Every jar, every note, every map. None of it had been created for profit, only preservation. She turned another page. Miles Crawford believes he is hunting wealth buried beneath my greenhouse. He is wrong. The real fortune has always been the land surrounding it. Walter looked toward her. The land? Claire kept reading. Beneath the eastern fields lies the last untouched wild population of Ashcombe crimson tomatoes, thought extinct since 1931. The patents filed decades ago were never commercialized. Today, they belong to you. Walter let out a slow breath. Claire reached the final paragraph. If greed reaches this room before kindness does, burn every document. If kindness arrives first, plant everything again. She carefully folded the letter against her chest. Neither she nor Walter noticed the faint red laser dot moving silently across the opposite wall. Someone outside the vault had just aimed a rifle into the room. Walter saw the red laser first. His eyes widened. Claire? She looked up. The tiny crimson dot rested on the letter in her hands. It slowly climbed toward her chest. Then, toward her forehead. Walter reacted without thinking. He lunged across the room, knocking Claire behind the heavy oak table. A deafening crack exploded through the vault. The bullet smashed into the cabinet behind them. Glass shattered. Clay jars burst apart. Thousands of carefully preserved seeds scattered across the stone floor. No! Claire cried. Walter grabbed her shoulder. Stay down! Another shot ripped through the doorway. This one struck the oak table, sending splinters into the air. A familiar voice echoed from the tunnel. It's over. Miles Crawford. Not through a phone. Not through one of his employees. He was here. I've spent 15 years chasing this room. His footsteps echoed slowly closer. I won't lose it to a waitress who inherited it by accident. Claire tightened her grip on Eleanor's letter. It wasn't an accident. Miles laughed. No? He stepped into the doorway. Expensive suit, mud-covered shoes, rain dripping from his shoulders. Behind him stood 4 armed men. One carried a rifle fitted with a laser sight. Another held a thick folder stuffed with legal papers. Miles looked around the vault with open admiration. So, he smiled. The old woman finally let someone in. Walter stood. The shotgun remained in his hands, only one shell left. Miles noticed. You won't shoot. Walter didn't answer. You've always been the reasonable one. Miles slowly pulled a folded document from his jacket. I brought something. He tossed it onto the floor. It slid across the stone until stopping near Claire. She unfolded it. A foreclosure notice, issued that very morning. To Crawford Development Group. Outstanding debt $183 million. Payment due immediately. Claire looked up. Miles didn't even pretend to hide the truth anymore. My lenders don't care about history. He spread his arms. They care about assets. His smile vanished. I promised them whatever was hidden beneath this property. Claire finally understood. He had never known what Eleanor protected. He had only known she was protecting something, and he had borrowed against a secret he couldn't prove existed. If he left empty-handed, everything he owned would disappear. Miles pointed toward the cabinets. Hand me every document. No. His expression hardened. You don't understand. Claire slowly stood. I understand perfectly. She held Eleanor's final letter high enough for everyone to see. You thought this was about money. Miles said nothing. It never was. She looked toward the shelves lining the vault. The real inheritance isn't hidden gold. She turned back toward him. It's proof. Miles frowned. Proof of what? Claire reached toward the nearest cabinet. She opened the top drawer. Inside lay hundreds of neatly organized property deeds, every one bearing official county seals. The first document she lifted carried a familiar signature, Arthur Crawford. Across the bottom, stamped in bold red ink, appeared one devastating word. Fraudulent. Miles's face drained of color. Walter quietly whispered, Eleanor wasn't hiding a fortune. Claire looked directly into Miles Crawford's eyes. She was hiding the evidence that could destroy yours. Miles Crawford didn't speak. For the first time since Claire had met him, he looked afraid. Not nervous. Not angry. Afraid. His eyes remained fixed on the document in Claire's hands, as though it were far more dangerous than the shotgun Walter still held. Where did you get that? He asked quietly. Claire answered without lowering the file. Eleanor wanted someone honest to find it. Miles took one slow step forward. That's impossible. No. Claire shook her head. What's impossible is pretending your family never stole from this town. One of the men behind Miles shifted uneasily. What documents is she talking about? Miles ignored him. Claire opened the cabinet drawer completely. Inside sat dozens of leather folders arranged alphabetically. Each carried a county seal. Each was marked with handwritten dates stretching back more than 50 years. Walter reached beside her and pulled out another file. He opened it, then another. His breathing slowed. My God! Claire looked over. What is it? Walter turned the folder so everyone could see. A survey map. The original eastern property boundary. Bright red ink circled nearly 300 acres. The Crawfords never owned this land. Miles's voice cracked like a whip. Enough! He lunged toward the table. Walter fired. The final shotgun blast thundered through the vault. The pellets slammed into the stone floor inches in front of Miles, sending chips of rock flying across the room. Nobody moved. Smoke drifted through the stale underground air. Walter calmly broke open the shotgun. Empty. He laid it on the floor. I've got no shells left. Miles stared at him. So why'd you waste your last shot? Walter smiled. I wasn't aiming at you. A deep, mechanical rumble rolled through the tunnel. Claire felt the floor vibrate beneath her boots. Then another sound joined it. Not machinery. Sirens. Faint at first, growing louder. Miles turned toward the tunnel entrance. What did you do? Walter folded his arms. When we found Eleanor's journal. He nodded toward Claire. She wasn't the only one who made a phone call. Claire finally remembered. The moment Walter had borrowed her phone while she was reading the first pages of the journal, she'd assumed he'd checked for signal. Instead, he had called Sheriff Daniel Mercer. Walter looked back at Miles. I told him if he heard a shotgun. The sentence ended beneath the growing echo of footsteps racing through the passage. Flashlights flooded the tunnel. County Sheriff's Office. A commanding voice filled the vault. Drop your weapons. Miles' men looked at one another. None of them fired. One by one, their rifles clattered onto the stone floor. Miles remained frozen. The sheriff stepped into the chamber surrounded by deputies. His eyes swept across the scattered seed jars, the shattered cabinets, the open vault, and finally stopped on the documents spread across the oak table. He recognized the official county seals immediately. Slowly, he removed his hat, then looked directly at Miles Crawford. I've been waiting 20 years to ask you one question. The vault fell completely silent. Sheriff Mercer unfolded the top property deed. His voice echoed against the ancient stone walls. "Mr. Crawford," he held up the document for every deputy to see. "Would you care to explain why your father's signature appears on a deed declared fraudulent by the State Land Commission?" Miles Crawford opened his mouth. No words came out. 3 months later, the Ashcombe County Courthouse had never been so crowded. Every wooden bench was filled. Local farmers, reporters, television cameras, former Crawford employees. Even people who hadn't spoken to one another in years now sat shoulder to shoulder waiting for the final ruling. Claire remained near the back of the courtroom. She never liked being the center of attention. Walter sat beside her wearing the same brown jacket he had worn the day they first met at the greenhouse. The only difference was the smile he no longer tried to hide. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Helen Morrison entered the courtroom. Everyone stood. Miles Crawford looked nothing like the confident businessman Claire had met at Eleanor's will reading. The expensive, tailored suits were gone. He wore a plain grey prison uniform beneath handcuffs linked by a short steel chain. Months of court hearings had hollowed his face. The arrogance had disappeared. Only exhaustion remained. The prosecutor approached the bench carrying several leather-bound ledgers recovered from Eleanor's second vault. "Your Honor," he placed the first ledger before the judge. "The evidence confirms a pattern of fraudulent property transfers beginning in 1998. He opened another file. 37 forged deeds. Another. 14 falsified land surveys. Another. And more than $200 million in illegally acquired development rights. The courtroom remained completely silent. Claire glanced toward Walter. His eyes never left the floor. He still blamed himself for helping Arthur Crawford decades earlier, even though Eleanor had forgiven him long before her death. The prosecutor continued. The Whitmore archives preserved every original document. He lifted a faded map. Without Miss Eleanor Whitmore's meticulous records, he nodded respectfully towards Claire, none of these crimes would ever have been uncovered. Judge Morrison carefully reviewed the final report before removing her glasses. Mr. Crawford, Miles slowly stood. You built an empire using forged records, intimidation, and deception. She paused. Worse, her voice became quieter. You attempted to destroy the very evidence meant to protect generations of honest landowners. She closed the final folder. This court finds you guilty on all counts. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Miles lowered his head. The judge wasn't finished. Every acre obtained through fraudulent deeds shall immediately return to its lawful owners. Another pause. Crawford Development Group is hereby ordered dissolved. Reporters erupted into frantic note-taking. Outside, church bells began ringing across downtown Ashcombe. Claire looked through the courthouse window. Farmers who had spent decades fighting impossible legal battles embraced one another on the courthouse lawn. Some cried openly, others simply stood in stunned silence. Walter quietly wiped his eyes. I wish Eleanor could have seen this. Claire smiled softly. I think she did. As deputies escorted Miles Crawford toward the courtroom doors, he stopped beside Claire. For several seconds he simply looked at her. Then he asked the one question that had haunted him from the beginning. What was really worth protecting? Claire thought of Eleanor's letter. The seeds, the ledgers, the forgotten families. She answered without hesitation. The future. Miles lowered his eyes. For the first time in his life, he had nothing left to buy. 1 year later, the greenhouse no longer looked abandoned. Morning sunlight poured through hundreds of newly restored glass panels, filling the building with warmth instead of silence. The cracked brick paths had been carefully repaired. The old iron framework had been repainted exactly as Eleanor had left sketches describing decades earlier. Nothing felt modern. It felt alive. Children wandered between rows of tomatoes, beans, herbs, and flowers once believed to have vanished forever. Volunteers from across the state worked beside local farmers, carefully labeling each heirloom variety before placing fresh seeds into handcrafted envelopes. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign. The Eleanor Whitmore Heritage Greenhouse. No corporate logos, no sponsor names, just the woman who had quietly protected it all. Claire walked slowly through the center aisle carrying a small watering can. She still couldn't believe people called her the director of the foundation. To her, she was simply doing what Eleanor had taught her years ago. Notice what everyone else ignores. Walter stood outside repairing a section of the old fence. He looked healthier than he had in years. When he spotted Claire, he raised one muddy hand and smiled. "Got visitors?" Claire looked toward the entrance. A school bus had just arrived. Dozens of elementary students spilled onto the gravel driveway, laughing as their teacher tried unsuccessfully to keep everyone together. One little girl stopped beside the restored rose garden. "Miss?" Claire walked over. "Yes?" The girl pointed toward a faded photograph hanging near the greenhouse entrance. It showed Eleanor standing among rows of blooming tomatoes many years earlier. Who was she? Claire looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she smiled. Someone who believed small things could change the world. The girl considered that answer carefully, then asked another question. Did they? Claire looked around the greenhouse. Researchers were documenting rare plants once thought extinct. Families harvested vegetables together. Local farmers exchanged seeds freely instead of buying expensive patented replacements. Birds nested beneath the restored roof beams. The place had become exactly what Eleanor had hoped it would become. Yes, Claire nodded. They really did. Later that afternoon, after the visitors had gone home and the greenhouse had grown quiet again, Claire walked to the eastern planting bed. She knelt beside the same loose brick where everything had begun. The brick still lifted easily. Inside rested the brass greenhouse key. She had placed it there weeks earlier. Not because she wanted to hide it, because some stories deserved a beginning. She gently covered it again, then noticed something tucked beneath the key. A tiny folded piece of paper. She frowned. She hadn't left that there. Claire unfolded it slowly. Only one sentence appeared in neat handwriting. Some gardens never stop growing. She smiled through tears. The handwriting wasn't Eleanor's. It belonged to one of the children who had visited the greenhouse the week before. Claire carefully folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. Then she looked toward the rows of growing plants stretching beneath the afternoon sun. Eleanor had been right all along. The greatest inheritance anyone could leave behind was never hidden beneath the ground. It was planted inside the people willing to protect what mattered. And that legacy would keep growing long after every fortune had been forgotten.